In the realm of fantasy literature, a curse is almost universally depicted as a mystical, invisible force. It is treated as a magical tether that physically binds a protagonist to a tragic fate, dragging them kicking and screaming toward an inevitable doom against their own rational will. We are taught to view the cursed hero as a victim of supernatural mathematics. But if we strip away the mythological framing of Tolkien's First Age and examine the tragedy of Túrin Turambar through the cold, uncompromising lens of clinical psychology, the magical illusion evaporates. What remains is not a story about a dark spell. It is the most grueling, devastating, and meticulously documented case study of generational trauma, chronic self-sabotage, and the terrifying architecture of a self-fulfilling prophecy ever committed to modern fiction. Today, on Mythology Deconstructed, we are going to dissect the mind of Middle-earth's most tragic figure. We will analyze how a man, entirely convinced that his fate was written by a dark god, systematically destroyed his own life, rejecting every sanctuary, burning every bridge, and making the most clinically disastrous decision at every single crossroads of his existence. To understand the absolute collapse of Turin, we must first aggressively demystify the so-called Curse of Morgoth. When Hurin, Turin's father, defied the Dark Lord Morgoth, chained him to a mountaintop, and cursed his entire bloodline, we are meant to believe that this curse acted as an invisible hand, steering Turin into tragedy. But Morgoth was not merely a physical tyrant. He was a master of psychological warfare. He did not need to use magic to destroy Turin. He only needed to implant a single, virulent cognitive distortion into the family's environment, the absolute, unwavering belief that they were doomed. Turin internalized this trauma from childhood. He grew up under the shadow of a father presumed dead in a catastrophic war, raised in a household suffocating under grief and the constant threat of invasion. By the time he was sent away to the elven kingdom of Doriath for his own protection, the psychological damage was already permanent. He had fundamentally fused his identity with the concept of tragedy. Doriath represents the first and most critical failure in Turin's psychological architecture. King Thingol took the boy in and raised him as an adoptive son. He was offered absolute safety, elite education, and unconditional love. He was handed a flawless sanctuary. But clinical psychology shows us that victims of profound, unresolved trauma often possess a terrifying inability to accept safety. When a mind is wired for disaster, peace feels unnatural. It feels like a trap. When Turin accidentally causes the death of the arrogant elf Cyros, we witness his first major act of self-sabotage. King Thingol was fully prepared to pardon him. The evidence pointed to an accident provoked by harassment. All Turin had to do was wait, face the judgment, and accept the forgiveness of a father figure who loved him. Instead, he fled into the wilderness to join a band of ruthless outlaws. Why does a rational man run from safety into violence? Because for Turin, safety caused cognitive dissonance. The idea that he was worthy of forgiveness, that he could live a stable, protected life, contradicted the internal narrative Morgoth had planted in his brain. By running away, he unconsciously validated his own trauma. He rejected sanctuary because the role of the hunted, isolated outcast was the only identity that made sense to his fractured mind. This flight from Doriath initiates a deeply disturbing behavioral pattern that defines the rest of his life. The pathological shedding of his own identity. Throughout his story, Turin constantly changes his name. He calls himself Nethin the Wronged, Gorthal the Dreadhelm, Agerwain the Bloodstained, and Mormogil the Black Sword. Audiences frequently interpret this as a series of epic, heroic titles. In reality, it is a textbook manifestation of dissociative behavior. Every time Turin makes a catastrophic mistake, every time his actions lead to the death of his friends or the ruin of a sanctuary, he is incapable of processing the immense guilt. The moral weight of his failures is too heavy for his fragile ego to carry. So, instead of facing accountability, he commits a psychological suicide. He kills the current version of himself and adopts a new name. He operates under the delusion that if he changes his title, the trauma of the past cannot follow him. When he arrives in the great underground fortress of Nargothrond, he refuses to give his real name and becomes the Mormogil, the Black Sword. Notice the clinical severity of this choice. He reduces his entire human identity to an inanimate object. A sword has no family. A sword has no past. A sword holds no moral responsibility for the blood it spills. It merely functions. By becoming a weapon, Turin attempts to completely amputate his own humanity to escape his pain. But trauma cannot be outrun, and it certainly cannot be erased by changing a name. His deep-seated arrogance, a desperate overcompensation for his internal feelings of powerlessness, leads him to convince the king of Nargothrond to abandon their secretive defensive strategy. Turin builds a massive bridge before the hidden doors of the fortress, openly challenging the armies of Morgoth. It is a monument to his own hubris, and it is the exact mechanism that allows the enemy to march straight into the city and slaughter its inhabitants. It is here, amidst the burning ruins of Nargothrond, that Turin faces the apex of his psychological nightmare, the dragon Glaurung. We must completely redefine how we view the dragon in this narrative. Glaurung is not simply a biological weapon breathing literal fire. In this specific scene, Glaurung acts as the ultimate malicious therapist of doom. When the dragon locks eyes with Turin, he does not incinerate him. He paralyzes him and begins to systematically dissect his mind. Glaurung weaponizes the truth. The dragon lists every single one of Turin's failures. He reminds him that he abandoned his mother and sister, that he repays sanctuary with ruin, and that his arrogance just caused the massacre of thousands of innocent elves. The dragon's spell is nothing more than the weaponization of Turin's own repressed guilt. Glaurung simply holds up a mirror to the cognitive distortions Turin has carried his entire life. And then, the dragon offers him a choice. He tells Turin that his mother and sister are suffering in the north, while his beloved, the elf Finduilas, is being dragged away by orcs to the south. Glaurung tells him he can only save one. Turin, completely broken by the realization of his own failures, falls directly into the trap. He abandons Finduilas to a horrific death to chase a phantom vision of his family in the north, a vision that is entirely false. He makes the wrong choice not because of magic, but because his mind, utterly compromised by guilt and the belief in his own cursed nature, instinctively gravitates toward the path of maximum emotional devastation. He collaborates with the dragon to ensure his own ruin. The final act of Turin's life in the forest of Brethil is a masterclass in the delusion of control. Having failed everywhere else, he adopts his final and most arrogant name, Turambar, which translates to Master of Doom. He believes that by hiding among simple woodsmen and declaring himself the master of his fate, he can finally sever the invisible strings of Morgoth's curse. But a man who has not healed his trauma cannot master his fate. He can only recycle his nightmares. He unknowingly finds his traumatized, amnesiac sister Nienor and marries her. He builds a fragile, artificial life built on the foundation of absolute ignorance. When the dragon Glaurung returns for the final confrontation, Turin manages to slay the beast. But with its dying breath, the dragon shatters the amnesia. The truth is revealed. Nienor, realizing she is pregnant with her own brother's child, throws herself from a ravine into the freezing waters below. When Turin awakens to discover the absolute, horrifying totality of what his life has amounted to, his psychological architecture suffers a total, irrecoverable collapse. He has run from judgment in Doriath. He has hidden behind fake names. He has built bridges that invited destruction. He has abandoned those who loved him. And despite his desperate, lifelong struggle to outrun the curse, he realizes that he was the one laying the tracks the entire time. He was the architect of his own hell. The curse of Morgoth was merely the suggestion of doom. Turin provided the labor. In the closing moments of the narrative, Turin speaks to his black sword Gurthang, asking if it will drink his blood and end his life. He drives the blade into the ground and throws himself upon it. We often read this suicide as a tragic punishment, the final victory of the Dark God. But clinically, it is something far more profound and disturbing. Throughout his entire existence, Turin tried and failed to control his environment, his relationships, and his destiny. He was a passenger in a vehicle driven by his own unresolved trauma. His suicide is not merely an act of despair. It is the first and only time in his entire life that he exerts absolute, undeniable control over his circumstances. Unable to master how he lived, he violently seizes control of how he dies. It is a desperate, terminal assertion of agency. He chooses the blade. But in that final, horrifying act of self-determination, he perfectly executes the very destruction Morgoth promised on that mountaintop decades before. It is the ultimate tragedy of the human condition. A man running so fiercely from the fire that he throws himself directly into the furnace.